Project MK Ultra. During the tense geopolitical atmosphere of the Cold War, a covert program was initiated by an intelligence agency with the aim of developing techniques for psychological manipulation and behavioral influence. This clandestine operation delved into areas such as mind control, altered perception, and the extraction of sensitive information through non-traditional and ethically questionable methods. Framed as a national security necessity, the program's actions were hidden not only from the general public, but also from many within the government itself. Beginning in the early 1950s, the operation spanned across numerous institutions, including hospitals, universities, military bases, and even nightclubs or unofficial safe houses in urban centers. What made this project particularly controversial was its routine violation of informed consent. Unwitting individuals were exposed to various mind-influencing agents, often without any indication they were being experimented on. Subjects ranged from everyday citizens to prisoners and psychiatric patients, many of whom suffered long-term psychological consequences. A central component of the program involved the administration of psychoactive substances to see how these would impact cognition, behavior, and resistance to interrogation. In numerous instances, individuals were approached under false pretenses or were simply drugged in public settings without their knowledge. The psychological toll was profound. Many experienced acute paranoia, hallucinations, disorientation, and in some cases, complete mental breakdowns. Despite these consequences, experiments continued unabated for years. One particularly disturbing tactic employed by the agency involved the creation of controlled environments where individuals were covertly observed. In certain cities, entire apartments were modified to include hidden cameras and two-way mirrors. Agents posing as civilians would engage with subjects in these spaces, secretly administering experimental compounds and observing the results in real time. The emotional and psychological vulnerability of these targets was not just overlooked, but often exploited. The experimentation wasn't limited to pharmacological substances. Techniques such as hypnosis, forced isolation, sensory deprivation, verbal degradation, and repeated exposure to traumatic stimuli were also employed. The goal was to reduce an individual's psychological defenses and observe their openness to suggestion, memory manipulation, and compliance. These techniques would later inform interrogation practices and propaganda strategies, though their ethical legitimacy was, and remains, highly contested. Among the most unsettling elements of this initiative was its targeting of society's most vulnerable. Individuals from psychiatric institutions, prisons, and among the homeless population were frequently selected because they lacked the means to object or bring attention to the violations they endured. In some cases, their participation was masked as part of routine treatment, while in others, they were deceived or coerced outright. The full extent of these abuses may never be known, as much of the documentation was deliberately destroyed during the 1970s when public inquiries began to unravel the scope of the program. In 1973, facing growing pressure and scrutiny, the head of the agency ordered the destruction of a vast number of files related to the project. This deliberate act of concealment made it incredibly difficult for investigators to uncover the full narrative. Nevertheless, thanks to persistent efforts by journalists, whistleblowers, and congressional inquiries, enough documentation and testimonies were recovered to piece together a disturbing picture of systematic abuse of power in the name of national defense. When the findings were presented to the public, there was widespread outrage. Civil rights groups, legal scholars, and ethicists condemned the actions taken under this program, sparking demands for legal reforms and greater oversight in scientific and government research. The revelations also led to the establishment of new standards regarding informed consent and institutional review boards designed to protect research participants from exploitation and harm. Even decades later, the legacy of this program remains both haunting and influential. It has become a cornerstone example in academic discussions on bioethics, the dangers of unchecked governmental authority, and the importance of transparency in public institutions. References to it appear frequently in popular culture, conspiracy theories, and legal texts, serving as a grim reminder of how scientific curiosity, when coupled with secrecy and authority, can lead to dangerous and inhumane outcomes. The remaining fragments of information suggest that the original goals of the program, to create a method for reliable mind control were ultimately unsuccessful. However, the damage done in pursuit of that goal was extensive and irreversible for many of those involved. Survivors of these experiments have reported lifelong psychological trauma, and some families continue to seek recognition and justice to this day. Ultimately, the lessons learned from this chapter in history underscore the necessity of ethical boundaries, especially in research and intelligence work. The true cost of this covert operation was not just measured in failed outcomes, but in the deep and lasting harm inflicted upon real human lives, all under the veil of secrecy and ambition. Operation Delirium. Operation Delirium was a military research initiative launched during the Cold War era, primarily between the 1950s and 1970s, that aimed to explore the effects of chemical compounds on human cognition, perception, and behavior. Conducted under the guise of defense preparedness, the project focused on developing non-lethal means of warfare, tools that could disorient, confuse, and disable enemy troops without causing permanent physical harm. What began as a scientific investigation into psychochemical agents soon morphed into a series of ethically complex, secretive, and deeply controversial human trials. At the heart of this project was Edgewood Arsenal, a military facility in Maryland that served as the central testing ground. Hundreds of U.S. military personnel were recruited, often underinformed or misled, into participating in experiments involving a wide range of chemical agents. These included substances that affected mood, memory, motor function, and perception of reality. Some of the compounds tested had never been used on humans before, and their long-term effects were unknown even to the scientists administering them. Participants were frequently exposed to powerful deliriants and psychoactive agents. The goal was to induce temporary confusion, hallucinations, speech disruptions, and memory impairments to see how an individual's mental state could be manipulated. Substances were often administered in liquid form or aerosolized for inhalation, and test subjects were closely observed in controlled environments. Researchers took meticulous notes, capturing every behavioral shift, cognitive lapse, and emotional reaction. The rationale behind these studies was rooted in a growing fear of chemical and biological warfare. Military strategists speculated that if a chemical agent could neutralize enemy soldiers by impairing their ability to think clearly or coordinate, it could serve as an effective weapon without the ethical and diplomatic fallout associated with lethal force. However, the line between scientific innovation and ethical transgression became increasingly blurred. One of the most infamous compounds tested was BZ, 3-quinaclidinyl benzylate, a powerful hallucinogen capable of rendering individuals incapable of coherent thought or communication for hours, sometimes even days. Soldiers exposed to BZ reported seeing vivid and terrifying hallucinations, hearing voices, or becoming completely disoriented. In some cases, they were unable to distinguish reality from delusion, even after the drug's effects should have worn off. Recovery was not always complete, and some individuals experienced lingering psychological symptoms. Perhaps most troubling was the fact that participants were not always fully aware of what was being done to them. Although they had signed consent forms, these documents were often vague, lacking detailed information about the substances involved or the risks associated with them. Many soldiers later claimed they were told they'd be testing equipment or protective gear, only to find themselves in the middle of a psychological experiment that left them deeply shaken. The tests were conducted in sterile, clinical environments, but the psychological toll was anything but clean or contained. Subjects were often left to cope with the emotional and cognitive aftermath of their experiences on their own. Counseling was minimal or non-existent, and in many cases, records of individual participation were lost or sealed, making it difficult for affected veterans to access medical care or recognition for the harm they endured. Operation Delirium remained classified for decades. It wasn't until investigative journalists and declassified documents shed light on the full extent of the program that the public began to understand what had taken place. A 2012 expose by The New Yorker played a pivotal role in bringing the story into mainstream consciousness, detailing how young, healthy soldiers were psychologically unraveled in the name of science and strategy. As with other secretive military experiments of the time, Operation Delirium raises profound ethical questions. To what extent should national defense override individual rights? Can a person truly give informed consent within a rigid military hierarchy? And what responsibility does a government bear when those it harms are its own citizens? Although the official rationale for the program was national defense, the legacy it left behind was one of mistrust, trauma, and unanswered questions. Many of the soldiers who participated, some still living, continue to suffer from psychological conditions they attribute to their time in the program. Efforts to seek recognition and compensation have faced bureaucratic obstacles, often complicated by the fact that key records were destroyed or remain inaccessible. Today, Operation Delirium stands as a sobering reminder of the ethical costs of scientific ambition when divorced from transparency and oversight. It is a testament to the resilience of those who endured it and a warning against the unchecked power of institutions acting behind closed doors. The story continues to unfold, not only through official channels, but also through the voices of veterans, journalists, and ethicists determined to ensure that such a history is never repeated. Guatemala syphilis experiments. In the late 1940s, a group of government-funded researchers embarked on a series of secret experiments in Central America that would remain hidden from the world for decades. Unlike other studies that mask themselves under the veil of national defense, this operation involved the deliberate infection of hundreds of individuals with a serious illness without their informed consent. These actions took place in Guatemala between 1946 and 1948, under the oversight of prominent medical officials who would later become deeply entrenched in American public health. The stated aim was to investigate the effectiveness of treatment options and preventive strategies, particularly the use of penicillin. However, the methodology employed went far beyond accepted ethical boundaries. Even for the time, researchers sought to understand how this illness could be transmitted and prevented by deliberately exposing human subjects to it, often using deceptive or coercive tactics. What makes this case especially disturbing is the deliberate use of vulnerable populations, such as sex workers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even children. To carry out these procedures, the team created controlled conditions where individuals were exposed to the illness through various methods. In prisons, inmates were told they were being treated for other conditions or being given preventative medication, while in reality they were being infected. In psychiatric hospitals, patients who could not give informed consent were used as test subjects. In some of the most distressing instances, doctors introduced the disease through invasive procedures, using tools like scraped skin or direct injections into the bloodstream. The level of planning behind the operation indicates that this was not a rogue experiment, but a state-sponsored initiative with backing from high-level medical and governmental authorities. It was led by Dr. John Charles Cutler, who later played a key role in other controversial research projects. At the time, the program was kept entirely secret. No public statements were made, no media were alerted, and no ethical review board, if it existed, ever intervened. It would take more than 60 years before the full details came to light. Documents from the experiment revealed deeply troubling insights. The subjects were often unaware of their condition. Many did not receive any treatment after infection. Others were tracked over time without any therapeutic intervention, purely to observe the natural progression of the illness. In some cases, the infection spread within families or to unrelated individuals who had contact with the participants. The long-term consequences were devastating, both for the victims and their descendants. In 2010, more than 6 decades after the experiments concluded, the story resurfaced when a medical historian discovered archival records while conducting unrelated research. The revelations prompted immediate condemnation from scholars, public health officials, and human rights advocates. The U.S. government issued an official apology to the people of Guatemala, acknowledging that what occurred was inexcusable, regardless of the scientific intent. President Barack Obama personally apologized to the president of Guatemala at the time, calling the experiments clearly unethical. A presidential commission was subsequently formed to investigate the details further. Their report confirmed that hundreds of individuals were exposed to serious risk without consent, and that the ethical standards violated during this project were shockingly low, even by mid-20th century norms. What continues to trouble observers today is how such an experiment could proceed with virtually no scrutiny. While some researchers of that era were indeed pushing boundaries in the name of scientific progress, the Guatemala studies represent an egregious overstep, one in which the value of human life was subordinated to data collection and scientific ambition. Unlike experiments where individuals were at least debriefed or given medical attention afterward, here many were left to suffer alone, confused and untreated. Survivors and their families have fought for recognition and restitution, though legal obstacles and jurisdictional issues have complicated the process. Most of those directly involved are now deceased, but their legacy lives on in communities still dealing with the intergenerational effects of trauma, disease, and poverty. Advocacy groups continue to call for more than symbolic gestures, demanding tangible reparations and deeper reforms in how medical research is governed. The Guatemala experiments are now cited in medical ethics courses around the world as one of the darkest moments in research history. They serve as a chilling reminder of what can occur when vulnerable populations are treated as tools rather than people. More importantly, they underscore the importance of informed consent, independent oversight, and transparency, not just in theory, but as enforceable standards in every corner of scientific practice. Even today, questions remain about whether all details have been disclosed. Some records are still held in archives, inaccessible to the public, and it's unclear whether similar experiments may have been conducted elsewhere under the radar. As more documents are declassified, the true extent of these practices might still come to light, painting an even more sobering picture of a time when ethics were too often overshadowed by unchecked experimentation. The legacy of the Guatemala syphilis experiments endures not just in medical textbooks or government reports, but in the lives that were altered without consent. It's a case that challenges us to examine the responsibilities of science, the limits of authority, and the basic rights owed to every human being, regardless of nationality, status, or vulnerability. Radioactive Chapatis. In the late 1960s, an obscure yet unsettling chapter in medical and scientific history quietly unfolded in one of the most densely populated cities in the world, Mumbai, India. Known informally as the Radioactive Chapatis case, this incident involved a bizarre and disturbing experiment where local residents, without consent or knowledge, became unwitting participants in an investigation into the effects of radioactive exposure through food. At its core, the incident centered around a staple of Indian cuisine, the chapati, a round, unleavened flatbread that forms the basis of millions of meals every day. But in this case, chapatis were used not as nourishment, but as carriers of a substance that had no place on a dinner table, radioactive isotopes. The aim of the experiment, as later uncovered, was to study how radioactive materials might move through densely populated environments and potentially through human bodies. Reports suggest that the radioactive material, most likely iodine-131 or a similar isotope, was embedded or smeared onto the surface of the chapatis and then discreetly distributed to specific neighborhoods in Mumbai, then Bombay, often targeting lower-income communities where suspicion of government or authority was minimal. Many of the residents who received these food items believed them to be part of charitable donations or religious offerings. As a result, they were consumed or brought into homes without question. Why would anyone consider conducting such an experiment? The prevailing theory is that the operation was an attempt to understand radiological spread in the case of a dirty bomb or nuclear incident in an urban setting. Scientists and defense planners at the time were increasingly preoccupied with the potential for radiological warfare or terrorism. They wanted data on how isotopes would disperse through human contact, how quickly they might spread through a population, and whether food could serve as a covert delivery method. But instead of using simulations or lab animals, the researchers opted for something far more ethically questionable: using real people without consent in real environments. The chapatis were traced back to a facility tied to a prominent atomic research center in India, which had connections to foreign agencies interested in nuclear defense and civilian exposure modeling. Whether this was a domestically driven experiment or one conducted in collaboration with outside intelligence groups remains unclear, as very few official documents have been released regarding the case. The most unsettling part of this story is not only that radioactive materials were introduced into people's homes, but that the government did not disclose the nature or risks of the event until years later. Many individuals who consumed or came into contact with these radioactive chapatis began experiencing unexplained health issues, headaches, nausea, rashes, and in some reported cases, longer-term complications like thyroid problems and reproductive disorders. But at the time, no medical explanation was given, and very few people connected their symptoms with the bread they had been given weeks or months earlier. It wasn't until the 1970s that investigative journalists and human rights advocates began asking questions. Whispers from within the scientific community suggested that this was more than a one-time incident. There were rumors of similar passive exposure tests being carried out in other locations, not just in India, but in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, regions that were, at the time, considered geopolitically expendable by some global powers. However, because documentation was sparse and most evidence anecdotal, it remained difficult to build a conclusive case. Eventually, pressure mounted. Journalists began piecing together eyewitness accounts, health reports, and leaked memos from within Indian scientific institutions. A pattern emerged, and the story finally reached national headlines. But rather than respond with full transparency, authorities attempted to minimize the issue. Officials claimed that any radiation exposure was well within safe limits and that no lasting harm had been done. For many affected individuals, this dismissal felt like a second betrayal. Efforts to track down and test the people who may have consumed these chapatis were largely ineffective. Because the exposure had been unannounced and untraceable, many of the victims were never identified. Worse still, any possible long-term health monitoring never materialized. For those suffering from unexplained illnesses, the government offered no targeted treatment, no compensation, and no public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The data collected during the experiment, if it still exists, is likely locked away in archives, inaccessible to journalists, historians, or ethicists. The ethics of the case are as radioactive as the chapatis themselves. To this day, no one has publicly claimed responsibility for authorizing or executing the experiment. Names remain redacted, institutions deny involvement, and survivors are left with questions that may never be answered. Unlike more publicized experiments that drew global condemnation, this one remains largely under the radar, spoken of quietly in academic circles but rarely mentioned in mainstream discourse. The case of the radioactive chapatis stands as a haunting symbol of scientific overreach, where the pursuit of data trumped human dignity. It reveals how easily the most vulnerable populations can be exploited under the guise of public interest or national security. Unlike high-profile research scandals that involve complex institutions or military organizations, this experiment was disturbingly simple in its execution. It used food, an object of trust and daily necessity, as the medium of manipulation, and in doing so, it weaponized one of the most basic elements of life against the people who depended on it most. Despite the passage of time, the story continues to circulate among researchers, investigative journalists, and bioethicists who study the dark chapters of scientific history. It is used as a case study in how not to conduct public health experiments, and as a reminder that the absence of transparency is often where the gravest abuses occur. The lack of accountability surrounding this incident has prompted calls for stronger international protections against non-consensual human experimentation, particularly in under-resourced regions where oversight is limited. The question remains, how many other stories like this are still buried? How many people have suffered in silence from experiments they never agreed to? The case of the radioactive chapatis may not be widely known, but its implications ripple far beyond the streets of Mumbai. It warns of a future in which scientific institutions, driven by fear or ambition, may again cross ethical lines unless held to firm and unbreakable standards. In the end, this is not just a story about chapatis laced with radiation. It's a story about trust, power, and the invisible lines that divide scientific curiosity from moral responsibility. Project Sunshine. In the years following the devastating bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world entered an era defined by nuclear tension, scientific ambition, and a growing awareness of the unseen consequences of radiation exposure. Within this volatile landscape, a classified research initiative emerged that would remain hidden from the public eye for decades. Known as Project Sunshine, This operation was not about light or optimism, despite its misleading name. It was instead a global effort to understand how radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons would affect the human body, specifically the bones. At the heart of this project was a simple but deeply disturbing premise: to determine how much radioactive material, particularly strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear detonations, was being absorbed into human tissue worldwide. Strontium-90 mimics calcium and tends to accumulate in bones and teeth, particularly in children, where bone growth is most active. Scientists feared that increasing levels of this isotope could lead to widespread health crises, including cancer and developmental disorders. But instead of conducting this research transparently or ethically, those behind Project Sunshine resorted to secrecy, and in some cases, outright body theft. The project began in the early 1950s and operated for more than a decade. It was overseen by a coalition of military, governmental, and scientific institutions in the United States, working in coordination with international partners. Researchers needed human tissue, particularly bone samples, from people of all ages and nationalities to understand how radioactive isotopes were spreading across the globe. The primary method, collecting human remains, often without the knowledge or consent of the families involved. In numerous cases, bodies, particularly those of infants and young children, were exhumed or taken directly from hospitals and morgues. Parents were either told their loved ones were being studied for unrelated reasons, or in many cases, not informed at all. Researchers extracted bones, especially the femur and skull, and sometimes even entire skeletons, to analyze radiation levels. The families were not given a chance to object, nor were they told of the experiment's true purpose. These samples were then sent to secret labs where technicians measured strontium-90 concentration using highly specialized equipment. One of the most infamous cases involved a young British child who died in the 1950s. Without the mother's knowledge, his legs were removed during autopsy and sent to the United States as part of the study. The grieving mother later discovered the truth only through declassified documents years later. This case was not an anomaly. Across multiple countries, including the UK, Australia, Canada, and parts of Europe, similar procedures occurred, with scientists harvesting tissue samples from thousands of deceased individuals, often from impoverished or marginalized communities. The sheer scale of Project Sunshine is staggering. By the late 1950s, over 1,500 samples had been collected from across the globe, many from infants and young children. These bodies became, in effect, silent test subjects in a global experiment on radioactive contamination. While some researchers argued the study was necessary to understand the effects of nuclear fallout, others within the scientific community raised ethical concerns even at the time, concerns that were ignored or suppressed under the umbrella of national security. Government agencies justified the program by claiming it would help policymakers understand the long-term risks of nuclear testing. After all, atmospheric tests were being conducted regularly in the Nevada desert, the Pacific Islands, and the Soviet Union. Fallout was drifting across borders and continents, carried by wind and rain, and entering food chains through contaminated soil and water. Knowing how much radiation was accumulating in human bones was considered vital for global safety planning, but the cost of this knowledge was paid, unknowingly, by thousands of grieving families. As the Cold War intensified, the secrecy around Project Sunshine only deepened. Documents were classified, findings were selectively published, and any discussion of tissue harvesting was buried under layers of bureaucratic language. Meanwhile, more samples were collected. Some were obtained through diplomatic channels, while others were sent in covert shipments disguised as medical or research materials. In countries with weak regulatory systems or colonial ties, obtaining such samples was often easier, raising further concerns about exploitation and consent. It wasn't until the 1990s, nearly half a century after the project began, that the full scope of Project Sunshine began to surface. Investigative journalists, declassified documents, and inquiries into Cold War-era research revealed a pattern of unethical behavior. In 1994, a U.S. Presidential Advisory Committee launched a formal investigation into human radiation experiments, including Project Sunshine. Their findings confirmed what many had long suspected, that human tissue had been used without consent and that the rights of families had been systematically violated. The public reaction was one of shock and outrage. Families demanded answers. Activists and ethicists called for reforms. Apologies were issued by government officials, but compensation or legal accountability remained minimal. The revelations prompted broader conversations about medical ethics, informed consent, and the responsibilities of researchers working within classified or military frameworks. What makes Project Sunshine so uniquely unsettling is that it wasn't a case of rogue experimentation or one-time negligence. It was a coordinated, long-term effort involving respected scientists, global institutions, and governments. It operated under the assumption that scientific knowledge could justify nearly any means of data collection, even the harvesting of human remains. The people involved may have believed they were acting in the name of public health or national security, but the moral cost was immense. To this day, Project Sunshine is studied in universities around the world as a prime example of ethical failure in research. It serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when scientific ambition is paired with unchecked authority and secrecy. The program also highlights how certain populations, particularly the poor, the young, and the voiceless, are often the ones most easily exploited in the name of progress. The legacy of Project Sunshine lingers not just in academic discourse, but in the lives of families who discovered that their loved ones' bodies were used in experiments they never agreed to. Some have tried to locate the missing remains. Others have fought for public acknowledgement or historical justice. But many will never know exactly what happened to the bodies of their children, siblings, or parents. In the end, the true cost of Project Sunshine wasn't just measured in strontium levels or bone data. It was measured in broken trust, stolen dignity, and the enduring scars of secrecy. It asks us to consider a difficult question. How far should we go in the pursuit of knowledge? And at what point does the search for truth begin to violate the very humanity it seeks to protect? Albert Kligman prison experiments. In the heart of Philadelphia during the mid-20th century, a series of medical experiments unfolded that would later become one of the most controversial and ethically disturbing episodes in American scientific history. These experiments, conducted primarily at Holmesburg Prison, were led by a prominent dermatologist named Albert Kligman, a man whose name would become both respected and reviled in medical and ethical circles alike. The setting was Holmesburg, a maximum security facility housing predominantly African American and economically disadvantaged inmates. At a time when societal structures already marginalized certain populations, the prison environment created a closed system where authority went largely unchecked and inmates had little recourse or power to resist. It was within this environment that Kligman saw not vulnerability or humanity, but, in his own words, a captive audience ideal for testing. Kligman initially entered Holmesburg in the 1950s with permission to treat skin conditions among inmates. But what began as dermatological assistance quickly expanded into an extensive human experimentation program. The inmates, many of whom had no access to legal counsel or proper health care, were offered small payments, sometimes only a few dollars, in exchange for participating in experiments involving everything from lotions and shampoos to radioactive isotopes and mind-altering substances. Often, they were not informed of the nature of the substances being tested or the potential risks involved. At the height of the program, Holmesburg Prison became a makeshift laboratory where inmates were subjected to a wide variety of chemical, biological, and pharmaceutical tests. These included exposure to harsh irritants, toxic agents, hallucinogens, and even substances intended for military use. Some of the experiments were commissioned or funded by large corporations, including major cosmetic and pharmaceutical companies, while others were connected to military research programs exploring chemical warfare and psychological manipulation. One of the most notorious procedures involved the application of blistering agents to inmates' skin. Inmates were often given limited information and asked to sign forms that did not fully explain what was being done. They were told the substances were harmless or low risk, when in fact they were enduring chemical burns, painful rashes, long-term scarring, and in some cases, unknown internal effects. Other tests included the injection of radioactive isotopes into the skin to study absorption, or the use of psychoactive drugs to monitor behavioral changes. Some prisoners were covered in patches or bandages saturated with chemicals, left on for days or weeks and monitored for reactions. Others were intentionally infected with various types of bacteria or fungi to observe the skin's immune response. These studies produced an array of data, some of which contributed to commercial products still in use today. Yet the cost in human suffering was incalculable. The underlying ethical issue was not just the nature of the substances or the results, but the environment in which the research took place. A prison population is not a truly voluntary one. While inmates technically consented to participate, the conditions under which that consent was obtained, poverty, isolation, lack of education, and coercion, make the legitimacy of that consent highly questionable. For many, the offer of a few dollars or extra privileges was too tempting to refuse, even if they didn't understand the consequences. Kligman himself appeared indifferent to the moral implications of his work. In interviews and later writings, he described his excitement at the opportunity the prison presented, often speaking of the inmates in clinical or dismissive terms. It wasn't until decades later that the full extent of the damage done began to surface, through the voices of former inmates who suffered long-term effects, both physical and psychological. By the 1970s, the growing movement for human rights and research ethics began to draw attention to the abuses at Holmesburg. Public outrage increased as investigative journalists and medical ethicists exposed the experiments. Eventually, the experiments were shut down, and reforms were introduced to prevent similar abuses in the future. However, despite the outcry, Kligman faced limited consequences for his actions. He continued his career, received prestigious awards, and even helped develop one of the most widely used acne treatments in the world, Retin-A. For the inmates who participated, however, the story did not end so neatly. Many experienced lingering health issues, emotional trauma, and deep mistrust of medical institutions. Some tried to sue or seek compensation, but legal barriers and the lack of preserved documentation made these efforts difficult, if not impossible. Their suffering was rendered invisible for decades. The Holmesburg experiments became a landmark case in the discussion of medical ethics, informed consent, and the treatment of vulnerable populations in research. They prompted renewed scrutiny of research practices in prisons and influenced federal policies requiring stricter oversight and protection for human subjects. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services eventually issued new regulations that limited or banned most forms of prisoner experimentation. In 2022, nearly 2 decades after Kligman's death, the University of Pennsylvania, the institution with which he was long affiliated, issued a formal apology for its role in supporting or ignoring the unethical research. A statue that had honored Kligman was removed from campus, and steps were taken to acknowledge the harm done to former inmates. While these actions represented a form of institutional reckoning, for many survivors, they arrived far too late. The legacy of these experiments remains a stark reminder of how institutional power, when unchecked, can lead to exploitation disguised as progress. It reveals how marginalized populations are often the first to be sacrificed in the pursuit of scientific knowledge, especially when those conducting the experiments see themselves as immune to ethical consequences. Ultimately, the story of the Albert Kligman prison experiments is not just about one man's ambitions or one prison's dark chapter. It's about a broader pattern of dehumanization in the name of research. It challenges us to consider how we value human life, especially the lives of those society has deemed disposable. And it serves as a warning that the cost of knowledge, when divorced from ethics and empathy, can be devastating. Perry Hudson's homeless experiments. In the 1950s and 1960s, a doctor named Perry Hudson carried out a series of medical experiments that would later be viewed as deeply unethical and exploitative. These studies targeted a particularly vulnerable population, homeless men living in and around New York City, under the guise of offering free medical care. What unfolded at a small hospital in Manhattan would ultimately become a troubling example of how desperation can be used as leverage in the name of scientific advancement. The experiments took place at the now-defunct Manhattan Veterans Administration Hospital, a facility that appeared at the time to be providing a charitable service to people who had nowhere else to turn. Perry Hudson, a physician and researcher, was focused on prostate disease, particularly the early detection and treatment of prostate cancer. At the time, prostate cancer was not well understood, and medical science lacked accurate diagnostic methods. Hudson believed that more aggressive and invasive techniques might provide better insight, but at a cost that others weren't willing to pay. In order to conduct his research, Hudson recruited hundreds of homeless men from shelters, soup kitchens, and the streets. These individuals were offered what seemed to be a generous exchange: food, a clean bed, and free medical attention. Many of these men were living with chronic illness, malnutrition, or untreated mental health conditions. To them, the offer sounded like salvation. But what they were not told, or not fully informed about, was that the free treatment involved extremely invasive and risky procedures, including surgical biopsies of the prostate gland. At the time, prostate biopsy was not the minimally invasive procedure it is today. Instead, Hudson used what was known as a perineal biopsy, which involved cutting through the skin between the rectum and scrotum to obtain samples of the prostate. These surgeries were painful, could result in complications such as infection or bleeding, and were often performed without any therapeutic intention. In many cases, the men undergoing these procedures did not even have symptoms of prostate issues. Furthermore, if cancer was found, which it often wasn't, Hudson subjected the participants to aggressive treatments such as full prostate removal, radiation, or hormone therapy, even in cases where there was no clinical reason to intervene. Many of these procedures led to permanent side effects, including incontinence, impotence, and chronic pain. The long-term psychological effects were also severe, as some men later reported feeling violated, confused, and betrayed by the very doctors they had trusted. One of the most shocking aspects of Hudson's work was the lack of informed consent. The men were not fully educated about the purpose of the study, the nature of the procedures, or the potential risks involved. In some cases, the consent forms were overly technical, misleading, or simply not provided at all. This failure to communicate transparently was not incidental. It was integral to how the research operated. Had the risk been fully explained, it's likely that many of the participants would have declined. The research was praised in some scientific circles at the time, largely because it yielded a vast collection of tissue samples and clinical data. But as ethical standards in medicine evolved, scrutiny grew around the methods used. The homeless men were essentially used as test subjects in a clinical laboratory, stripped of autonomy and treated as a means to an end. They were seen not as individuals, but as bodies from which data could be extracted. What makes the Perry Hudson case especially disturbing is that it occurred in a context where social inequality already defined the lives of those involved. The participants had few rights, no advocates, and little understanding of how they were being used. There was no institutional oversight, no ethics board review, and no accountability. Medical journals published Hudson's work without questioning how the data had been collected or what toll it had taken on the human beings behind the numbers. The experiments eventually lost momentum, not because of ethical concerns, but because other less invasive screening methods were developed. Hudson quietly faded from the public spotlight, and the homeless men who had been his subjects were left to cope with the consequences of procedures they never fully agreed to. Some vanished into the same streets from which they had been recruited, carrying with them physical damage and psychological trauma that would never be acknowledged or treated. Today, the Perry Hudson experiments are rarely discussed outside academic bioethics circles, yet they remain a powerful example of medical exploitation. The story is particularly important because it illustrates how easily the promise of help can become a tool for manipulation when directed at people with no power, no voice, and no protection. In modern research, the principles of informed consent and ethical review are now considered foundational. But the legacy of Hudson's work remains a cautionary tale, one that reminds us how far the medical field can stray when ethics are overridden by ambition and when human dignity is disregarded in the pursuit of data. The tragedy of these experiments lies not only in what was done, but in how easily it was allowed to happen. The men involved were never given a platform to share their experiences. Their pain went unrecorded, their suffering unnamed. For decades, their stories existed only in hospital files and research articles that treated them as numbers, not people. Today, revisiting these stories isn't just about pointing fingers. It's about recognizing the cost of silence, the danger of unchecked authority, and the ongoing need to protect those who have the least. Because if history has shown us anything, it's that scientific progress should never come at the expense of human rights. Syphilis and plague on U.S. citizens. In the dark shadows of American medical history, there exists a lesser-known but equally disturbing series of experiments involving the deliberate exposure of U.S. citizens to infectious diseases, including syphilis and bubonic plague, without their informed consent. Carried out primarily during the 1930s and 1940s, these government-sanctioned programs were rooted in a combination of fear, eugenics-era ideology, and a disturbing willingness to place scientific advancement above human dignity. The most well-known of these trials took place in San Francisco and other parts of California, where public health officials, in collaboration with military and research institutions, deliberately released bacteria into densely populated areas to study how disease might spread in urban environments. These efforts were often framed as part of national defense strategies, intended to simulate biological attacks and test the country's preparedness. But the reality was far more grim. In one such case, the U.S. Navy conducted Operation Sea Spray in 1950. Without notifying the public, military ships off the coast of San Francisco released a bacterial agent called Serratia marquescens into the air over the city. The goal was to study how the bacteria would disperse in a real-world urban environment. Within days, residents began reporting unusual respiratory infections. At least one man died of a urinary tract infection caused by the same bacteria, and dozens more were hospitalized. But officials denied any link between the outbreak and the secret military operation. The test was considered a success in technical terms, and similar exercises were repeated in cities like St. Louis and New York. But these airborne dispersion tests were only one part of a broader pattern. Years earlier, in Chicago and several southern cities, researchers had turned their attention to sexually transmitted infections, particularly syphilis. In these experiments, marginalized groups, including low-income African Americans, incarcerated individuals, and people receiving public health services, were used as test subjects for medical trials involving syphilis and plague vaccines. One deeply troubling case took place in the early 20th century when U.S. Public Health Service researchers infected inmates at San Quentin State Prison with bubonic plague, the same disease responsible for the Black Death centuries earlier. The goal was to develop a vaccine, but the methods were crude and dangerous. While the prison population may have technically consented, there was no real informed consent in the modern sense. The prisoners were offered minor incentives, such as sentence reductions or basic privileges, and not fully informed of the risks they faced. Some of the participants developed serious complications, and at least one death was reported, though it was largely ignored by the institutions responsible. Another major case unfolded in the Deep South, involving what some have described as a covert biomonitoring operation. Between the 1930s and 1940s, dozens of poor Black Americans were deliberately exposed to syphilis in hospitals and public health clinics without their knowledge. While the Tuskegee study is often cited as the most infamous syphilis experiment, these lesser-known trials preceded or occurred alongside it, often without even the pretense of monitoring disease progression. In some instances, syphilis was intentionally introduced through injections, under the guise of routine medical treatment. These experiments were carried out in secrecy under a veil of scientific legitimacy. Participants were told they were receiving treatment for minor conditions like colds, anemia, or fatigue. In reality, they were being exposed to life-altering and potentially deadly infections. No follow-up treatment was provided. Many went on to suffer from long-term complications, neurological damage, blindness, and organ failure. The burden extended to their families as well, as partners and children were sometimes unintentionally infected due to lack of disclosure or treatment. Even more shockingly, some of the diseases tested were weaponized strains developed for use in potential bioconflict scenarios. During World War II and the early Cold War, concerns about biological warfare prompted secret collaborations between military labs and civilian hospitals. Some of the diseases studied, like Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, were tested under laboratory conditions that lacked proper safety protocols. In multiple cases, lab workers and nearby residents became infected, and several lost their lives. Throughout these programs, the victims were overwhelmingly poor, marginalized, and powerless. Most had no access to legal counsel or advocacy. Their illnesses were often misdiagnosed or dismissed, and their medical records were classified or destroyed. In some instances, families were never told the true cause of death, leaving them without closure and often blaming themselves for what were in fact deliberate exposures, orchestrated by authorities. Public awareness of these experiments remained low for decades. It wasn't until the late 1970s and early 1980s that investigative journalists and academic researchers began to uncover documentation proving the existence of these unethical trials. Congressional hearings were held, but much of the focus was directed toward better-known programs like Tuskegee and MKUltra. As a result, the stories of plague and syphilis exposure were largely forgotten or intentionally buried. Ethicists and historians have since argued that these experiments violated not just medical norms, but basic principles of human rights. The absence of consent, the exploitation of vulnerable populations, and the lack of accountability point to a systemic pattern of disregard for human life in the name of scientific progress. What makes these cases especially chilling is the sheer normalization of the practice at the time. Among some in the medical and scientific communities, it was considered acceptable, even necessary, to experiment on the undesirable or expendable portions of the population. This dehumanizing mindset allowed atrocities to be committed not by rogue individuals, but by respected institutions with government funding and academic backing. To this day, many of the victims and their descendants have never received apologies, recognition, or compensation. Their suffering remains a largely unacknowledged chapter of history, one that challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily science can become a tool of oppression when left unchecked. These experiments serve as a stark warning that scientific progress, when divorced from ethics and humanity, can become indistinguishable from cruelty. They remind us that behind every data point is a human life, and that the real cost of discovery can be borne by those with no voice to protest and no power to refuse. Minnesota Starvation Experiment. In the midst of World War II, as battles raged across continents and millions faced the devastating consequences of conflict, a different kind of war was quietly being fought in the laboratories of the University of Minnesota. This was not a war against enemy forces, but against hunger itself, an attempt to understand starvation on a scientific level and prepare for the massive humanitarian crises expected after the war ended. What resulted was one of the most intense and ethically complex studies in the history of modern psychology and nutrition, the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Conducted between 1944 and 1945, the study was led by Dr. Ankle Keys, a prominent physiologist known for his work in human biology and nutrition. With support from the U.S. War Department and the Civilian Public Service, the experiment sought to simulate famine conditions that civilians and prisoners of war might face in post-war Europe and Asia. Its stated goal was noble: to gather reliable data on the physical and psychological effects of starvation, and more importantly, to determine how best to refeed and rehabilitate those who had been severely malnourished. But behind this mission of humanitarian science lay a grueling reality for the participants: 36 young, healthy men who had volunteered as conscientious objectors. These men, all of whom refused to fight in the war on moral or religious grounds, agreed to take part in the study as an alternative to military service. They believed their suffering would help save lives. What they didn't fully anticipate was just how much they would be pushed to the limits of human endurance. The experiment was divided into 3 distinct phases: a 12-week control period, a 24-week semi-starvation phase, and a rehabilitation phase that lasted from 12 to 20 weeks. During the control period, participants were fed a standard diet of 3,200 calories per day and underwent rigorous baseline testing to assess their mental and physical health. Then came the heart of the experiment, the semi-starvation phase, where caloric intake was drastically reduced to approximately 1,570 calories per day, roughly half the normal requirement for adult males performing physical activity. The diet was intentionally designed to mimic wartime famine conditions, consisting largely of potatoes, turnips, rutabagas, and bread. Participants were required to continue engaging in regular exercise, walking 22 miles per week and performing assigned tasks, despite the severe caloric deficit. The effects were immediate and severe. Within weeks, the men began to lose weight rapidly, an average of 25% of their body mass over the course of the semi-starvation phase. But the weight loss was just the beginning. As the weeks dragged on, the psychological effects of prolonged hunger became more and more pronounced. Subjects became obsessed with food, collecting recipes, reading cookbooks, and even dreaming about meals. Meals became rituals, with participants cutting their small portions into tiny pieces to prolong the experience of eating. Their emotional states deteriorated. Participants reported deep depression, irritability, anxiety, and feelings of social withdrawal. Even formerly extroverted individuals became reclusive. Interest in activities, relationships, and even personal hygiene declined. Some participants exhibited signs of severe mental distress, including hysteria and paranoia. One man was eventually removed from the study after he suffered a psychological breakdown and attempted to harm himself. Sexual desire nearly disappeared in many of the subjects. Their bodies became frail, their skin pale, and their physical endurance dropped dramatically. They complained of dizziness, muscle soreness, swelling in their legs and feet, and sensitivity to cold. In medical terms, they were reaching a state of clinical starvation. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the experiment was the toll it took on their sense of identity and self-worth. Many of the participants described feeling like shells of their former selves, disconnected, hollow, and unable to think about anything other than survival. The mental fog and emotional numbness became so severe that even simple tasks required great effort. The final stage of the experiment, the rehabilitation phase, was designed to test different approaches to recovery and refeeding. The participants were divided into subgroups, each receiving different calorie levels and dietary compositions. Surprisingly, the study found that refeeding was a slow and difficult process. Simply increasing caloric intake did not result in immediate recovery. In fact, some participants experienced digestive distress and emotional instability as their bodies struggled to adapt. Only those who received significantly more calories, upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 per day, began to show signs of substantial recovery within the test period. Others continued to feel weak, depressed, and mentally foggy even weeks after being reintroduced to a normal diet. This finding became critical in shaping post-war relief efforts in Europe, where millions of civilians and former prisoners required carefully monitored refeeding programs to survive. While the experiment did achieve its scientific goals, providing valuable data that influenced international food aid policies and famine response protocols, it also raised enduring ethical questions. The participants had volunteered, yes, but the extent of their suffering was extreme, and the psychological trauma they endured lasted far longer than anticipated. Several of the men later reported that the experiment was one of the most difficult periods of their lives, leaving them with lasting emotional scars. Dr. Keyes and his team defended the study by pointing to its contribution to the greater good. The detailed records from the experiment were later compiled into a 2-volume, 1,300-page report titled The Biology of Human Starvation, which remains a seminal work in the fields of nutrition and human physiology. Yet even among scientists, opinions are divided. Some view it as a necessary sacrifice during a time of global crisis. Others argue that it walked a fine ethical line, one that modern institutional review boards, IRBs, would never approve today. Today, the Minnesota starvation experiment is taught in universities not only as a landmark in nutritional science, but as a cautionary tale about the intersection of science, ethics, and human suffering. It prompts difficult but essential questions. How much suffering is justifiable in the name of progress? Can the ends ever truly justify the means, especially when real human lives are affected? The participants, often called the 36 volunteers, are remembered not just as research subjects, but as individuals who endured tremendous physical and emotional hardship in hopes of helping others. Their sacrifice helped shape global humanitarian responses guided medical protocols for starvation treatment, and influenced how clinical trials are regulated today. Their legacy is one of both heroism and warning, a reminder that even the most well-intentioned science must never lose sight of the human beings at its center. Facebook Emotional Contagion Study. In June 2014, the world was taken by surprise when a scientific paper surfaced revealing that Facebook, the largest social media platform in the world at the time, had conducted a secret psychological experiment on nearly 700,000 users without their explicit knowledge. The study, known as the Emotional Contagion Experiment, sent shockwaves through the fields of psychology, ethics, and technology. At its core, it asked a simple but unsettling question. Can your emotions be manipulated simply by changing what you see online? The answer, as it turned out, was yes, and the implications of that answer opened a Pandora's box of ethical debates. The study was carried out in January 2012 by Facebook's core data science team, in collaboration with researchers from Cornell University and the University of California, San Francisco. The findings were later published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS, under the title Experimental Evidence of Massive-Scale Emotional Contagion Through Social Networks. But it wasn't the results that caused the controversy, it was the method. Without informing users or asking for their consent, Facebook modified the news feeds of 689,003 English-speaking users. These users were unknowingly placed into different experimental groups. For one group, Facebook reduced the number of positive posts appearing in their feeds. For another, they reduced negative posts. A control group experienced no changes. Over the course of 1 week, Facebook's algorithm silently tweaked what these users could see, and researchers observed whether users began posting more positive or negative content themselves. In essence, they were measuring whether seeing fewer happy or sad posts would make people happier or sadder, whether emotions could spread digitally in the same way they do in face-to-face interactions. The findings confirmed their hypothesis. When users were shown fewer positive posts, their own status updates tended to become slightly more negative. Conversely, those who saw fewer negative posts became slightly more upbeat. The researchers concluded that emotional contagion could occur even without direct interaction, meaning that simply viewing emotionally charged content could alter a person's mood and behavior at scale. Scientifically, this was a major discovery. Psychologists had long known that emotions could be contagious in real life. People often reflect the moods of those around them, a phenomenon seen in families, workplaces, and public spaces. But this study suggested that the same emotional transmission could occur in a digital environment, where interactions were passive, silent, and algorithmically curated. However, the excitement over the results was quickly drowned out by a tidal wave of public and academic outrage. Critics argued that Facebook had essentially used its users as lab rats, subjecting them to psychological manipulation without their knowledge or consent. Even though the changes to users' feeds were subtle and the emotional effects were minor on an individual level, the principle of the matter raised serious ethical questions. Key among these was the issue of informed consent. In traditional psychological research, participants are told what the study involves, what risks are present, and what their rights are, including the right to withdraw at any time. But in the Facebook experiment, users had no idea they were being manipulated. The company argued that users had already agreed to its terms of service, which allowed data to be used for research, but this language was vague and offered no indication that emotional or behavioral experimentation would occur. Adding to the discomfort was the power imbalance. Facebook's algorithm is a black box that determines what billions of people see every day. Most users don't understand how their feed is shaped, or that it can be tweaked in ways that influence their emotions. The fact that this control was used for an undisclosed psychological study, even temporarily, felt like a betrayal of trust to many. Academics, too, weighed in. Several ethicists pointed out that the study may not have passed Institutional Review Board (IRB) approval at a university level, particularly since it involves psychological intervention without consent. The controversy became so intense that Cornell University was forced to issue a public statement clarifying that its researchers only had access to analyze data, not the Facebook users themselves. The lead researcher at Facebook, Adam Kramer, later defended the study in a public post, expressing regret that the research had caused so much anxiety. He insisted that the emotional impact on users was minor and the goal was to improve user experience, not to harm or manipulate. But for many, the damage was already done. The emotional contagion study became a landmark example of the ethical gray areas surrounding big data, social media, and digital psychology. Unlike traditional research, tech companies have access to massive data sets, real-time behavioral tracking, and algorithmic control over content. This opens up enormous opportunities for insight, but also for abuse. It also raised broader questions about digital autonomy. If a company can manipulate what you see, and by extension how you feel or behave, where does your free will begin and end? If your emotional state is even slightly influenced by an invisible algorithm, are you truly in control of your online experience? In the years that followed, the controversy sparked calls for stricter regulation of online experimentation. Many scholars advocated for clearer ethical guidelines when dealing with passive users of digital platforms. Some argued that companies like Facebook should be subject to the same research standards as universities and public institutions. Others went further, calling for legislation to prevent similar experiments from being conducted without consent. It also forced a broader conversation within the tech industry about responsibility and transparency. Users became more aware of how algorithms shape their experiences, and developers faced increasing pressure to design systems that prioritize ethical considerations, not just engagement metrics or business goals. Today, the Facebook Emotional Contagion Study remains a critical case study in university courses on ethics, digital media, and behavioral science. It serves as a reminder that technology is not neutral. The systems we interact with every day are designed, modified, and tested, often without our knowledge. And when those systems are capable of affecting our emotions and behavior, the stakes are high. In a world increasingly governed by algorithms, the Facebook study is not just a cautionary tale about one company's overreach. It's a glimpse into a future where psychological influence is automated, scaled, and largely invisible. And it asks a question we must continue to wrestle with. How do we balance innovation with integrity when the subjects of our experiments are millions of unsuspecting people? Ending. What do you think was the most disturbing experiment? We've just explored some of the most unsettling and ethically questionable experiments ever carried out, many of which were hidden from the public for years, even decades. From psychological manipulation to physical harm, from secret tests on soldiers to unknowing civilians, these stories challenge our understanding of science, ethics, and power. But now we want to hear from you. Which experiment shocked you the most? Was it the silent manipulation of emotions on social media? The chemical trials on unsuspecting soldiers? Or perhaps the invasive studies done on society's most vulnerable? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a real conversation about the balance between research and responsibility. If you found this video thought-provoking, give it a like to support the channel, subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation, and share it with a friend who needs to know the truth behind these hidden histories. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the true ones we were never supposed to know.